just put the New York Times in context. I mean, is the New York Times, does it consider itself the world's preeminent newspaper, would you say?
Yes, absolutely. And in the US, that's very much the case. And I think it's not just them who consider it to be the world's preeminent newspaper, but many other people around them. I think the entire American media ecosystem sort of centers around the New York Times. And they very much set the news agenda for the news industry and for policymakers, decision makers, business leaders in the US and around the world. So the way that I think of the New York Times is the flagship of the American news media. And they've been that way for the better part of a century, at least.
Right. And I know that what you're going to tell me is that this reputation is slightly undeserved, given how fast and loose it plays with the truth.
Yeah, in a way, it is very much deserved because they put an incredible amount of marketing energy and using the levers of power to maintain that the myth of the New York Times. It's a Wizard of Oz type institution where you pull back the curtain and you don't see the this booming wizard. You see a man that's very human, very flawed, that's just pulling some levers and pushing some buttons to create this effect. And what in reality is that this is a dynasty that owns and controls the newspaper. It's a patriarchy for all intents and purposes. And it is very much one that promotes its own agenda, and that agenda might be a business agenda in many cases, and in other cases it's an ideological agenda. But either way, the result is that they often misconstrue the truth. They alter history, they edit reality in ways that serve their interests, and in ways that certainly downplay, obscure, or just outright destroy the true reality of the events.
Yeah. This all gels with what I've had this massive apocalyptic awakening in the last 18 months. I spent most of my career as a journalist in the mainstream media, and I genuinely believed, and people are going to think I'm shockingly naive, I genuinely believe that the job of a journalist is to seek after the truth, however uncomfortable it might be, however much it might contradict one's own political opinions or prejudices. And I thought that all journalists were like that. I mean, if you'd asked me 20 years ago about the New York Times, I'd have said, well, it's kind of a bit stiff and boring. It's not as exciting as the UK media, but it's written with authority, and I'm sure that they do their best to try and present the truth as they find it. Of course, none of this is true, and I'm sure what I'm saying applies not just to the New York Times, but all the mainstream media. But just tell me before we go into grisly detail, who founded the Sunday Times? Oh, sorry, the New York Times, and who is it in the same? Has it always been in the same family?
So the original founder, and this is going back to the 19th century, was a man named Henry Raymond, but it transferred hands toward the end of the 19th century, and it was bought by an American immigrant, a German Jewish immigrant named Adolf Ochs. And Ochs is the one who really started the New York Times as we know it today. He's the one that made it a success. He rescued it from bankruptcy. And he's the one who founded this dynasty that is in control of the New York Times today, and as they have been for the last 120 years. So that they run it in that manner. They have this sort of like two-tiered stock structure that ensures that they maintain control of the paper essentially forever. And that's a lot of the problem behind what's going on at the paper.
Is it actually profitable? I mean, I can't imagine anyone wanting to buy this piece of crap anymore. They surely don't get the subscription sales anymore, do they?
Well, so they have recently reconceived their business model that much like the rest of the media is trying to do, where the internet destroyed the advertising business model of journalism. The New York Times has put all of its cards in subscription. And Donald Trump turned out to be the biggest boon possible for the New York Times, who absolutely hated Trump, of course. He drove something like $1 billion in subscription revenues within just a few years. But the subscription model that they've switched to has had a very interesting effect on on the newspaper and on the coverage, because it means that only 2% of their total readership are actually paying for the product. And that polarizes the news. It does it the same way that we see news being polarized on Facebook. That's something the New York Times has really gone after Facebook for, ironically, which is using algorithms that polarize news in order to drive traffic, to drive revenue. And the New York Times has actually adopted a model that is doing the very same thing.
So you mean all their news stories are geared towards titillating the 2% of crazies stupid enough to finance them? Is that more or less it?
Yeah, when you look at the 1619 Project, which has drawn a lot of controversy in the US, and this is their huge journalistic initiative that is supposed to reframe American history from being rooted in liberty to being rooted in slavery. So rather than 1776 as the birth of America, when it was declared independence from Britain, it is now 1619, where the first slaves, the year the first slaves arrived in the colonies. And you have to ask yourself, why would they embark on such a perilous adventure, and one that was so fraught with error and falsehood and outright lies that were called out by everybody from the far left to the far right? And the answer is because it was the centerpiece of their marketing effort to market towards young, woke millennials, the ones who are actually going to be willing to shell out. And they're not going to shell out for kind of that boring humdrum gray stuff that you were thinking about in the 90s, the 2000s, that the New York Times was called the gray lady for. But they're going to spend their hard-earned money on sort of irrelevant newspaper subscriptions because it energizes the base, because it polarizes, because it's a them versus us approach to covering the news.
Right. But how much of it is, do you think the New York Times, the real purpose of the guys who, the controlling family, is there real purpose to use it as a money-making vehicle, or is that perhaps secondary to their mission to, to destroy Western civilization along the lines being proposed by the Great Reset and all these other, the Bilderberg, the Council on Foreign Nations? We know that the world is really run by these kind of special interest groups, these think tanks, this elite of the elites. They're the ones pushing for all the bad things that are going on in the world right now. Is the New York Times really just the kind of the hymn sheet for that, or does it still consider itself a commercial venture?
I mean, you look at you look at the revenues, and you look at how important it is for them to rebuild a business model that can keep them profitable. You look at their share price, which has gone up drastically in the last 5 to 10 years.
Has it?
This is a business that brings in $2 billion of revenue per year, that's controlled by a family of just a few dozen people. So I think money is, greed is never to be underestimated, especially in any American institution. And I do think that it plays a huge role in terms of those other countervailing forces, regarding what is the other agenda, what are the secret agendas. I think in their case, it's actually quite out in the open. When you are trying to reframe American history in this really mendacious way, in a way that they know it's been done willfully, knowingly, that they're publishing falsehoods in order to literally rewrite history, the agenda is really out in the open. It is to subvert traditional values, and they're not sort of covering it up. They're being quite open about it.
Right. Actually, can I just say I'm really enjoying this podcast. I don't always say this, and actually I enjoy most of my podcasts, but you really know your stuff, and it's an absolute joy just sort of pointing you and letting you get on with it.
Thank you.
No, it's good. Has your book yet got onto the New York Times bestseller list?
No, it hasn't. Whether the numbers, they don't really reveal the secret sauce to what drives those lists. But what is clear is that the New York Times, and this is something they've actually argued in court, the New York Times considers that bestseller list to be an editorial property, which means that It's a subjectively chosen list. It's not about the numbers. It is about their choice and their decision making. And that's why books like this that come and try to tell a different kind of version of the truth to the ones the New York Times is peddling are often sidelined, and they're squelched because people are afraid of the New York Times. The New York Times bestseller list is probably the most effective book marketing tool in the world. To get on that list is, every publisher and author's dream, and nobody wants to piss them off for that reason. Yeah. And for that reason, people want to keep books like mine out of the limelight, out of the spotlight. They don't want people reading them. But fortunately today we do have other avenues.